I'd like to invite the rest of the panelists up for a quick Q&A and closing of the symposium.
You could just swipe left.
There were other paths that were possible that had been considered when they chose the path that they took, which is bizarre, and one lives right next to that crazy whatever. Could you say a little bit about what those other paths were and what parts of the town those have affected?
Okay, the other really main one was down what a street called Pierce Butler Route. And Pierce Butler Route already had railroad tracks. There was no housing. It was a lot of abandoned manufacturing buildings. So it would have been easy to just do the alignment or do the light rail down that. And during the whole political thing about I-94, there was a gentleman, a planner that the Federal Transit Administration had sent to be a consultant with the team in St. Paul about the planning, and he actually did not want the planners and the engineers to put it down I-94. He kept saying, put it down Pierce Butler route. So that was really the only route that they had, other one that they had considered other than right down the middle of my community.
So the railroad didn't stop it or whatever, they just said, this is what we want for any reason besides getting rid of, they just thought it was the most direct?
They thought it was the most direct route, and it was easiest. It was an easy route. And again, were you here on Monday or yesterday? Not Monday. Okay, well, Marvin pointed out, he had a map that showed redlining in the communities by the government. And it showed, you know, the good neighborhoods versus the slums. And our neighborhood was the slum. So of course, that was an easy neighborhood to say, well, let's just bulldoze that neighborhood down because it's a slum. And so that's one of the reasons or how they determined that the route could go through our neighborhood. And plus, the planners talked about, you know, progress and it'll help redevelop this neighborhood because it's a slum. And so that's mainly why they decided to put it through our neighborhood, the predominantly African-American neighborhood, because it was at that time considered a slum.
I mean, sort of as what Marvin also put it, there was an active social engineering that was framed by anti-Blackness, right, and the construction of Black neighborhoods as slum in the first place. Yeah. Other questions?
I'd like to hear you talk more among yourselves about the issue of skepticism about reparations, and I think it was brought out. I don't know who was speaking yesterday, and I apologize, but talking about the indigenous nation that has refused a large settlement because what they want is land. And I think that issue of reparations and it's it's sort of even if the financial piece is possible, and I think, Michael, that you demonstrated that it's entirely possible, but even if that financial piece is possible, is it adequate redress for what the core, for what the core issues are?
That's a great question.
Come on.
No.
I mean, I would just say, I don't think any monetary settlement could be adequate redress. I don't even think land would be adequate redress because all the people lost, all the suffering, all the struggle, right? Like you can't. There's no amount that will make up for that, you know. But at least for me, that wouldn't be the question, you know. I think the question would be, like, I think it's perfectly appropriate to say, for instance, land matters more than money or anything else. Or it could be for some people, education matters more, like tuition. There could be a number of different things. I think whatever those things are, it is possible to quantify them. It is possible to make the case for them. I think one of the interesting paradoxes of the law is that, like, there are many people who would contest reparations as a political movement, but would have to concede that in the right context, the right legal argument could be made that could win a certain settlement, right? And so I think that is like one of the paradoxes of the law that we live with, right? That there's all kinds of injustice that's built into the criminal justice system, into social life in the U.S., and yet there are moments when you can seize the opportunity to kind of weaponize the law on your behalf, or to mobilize public opinion on your behalf, or whatever. So at least for me, the question would be more like, what does our group, our constituency, our community feel like we need to thrive, to prosper, and how do we make the argument about getting it, you know? But I actually think the idea of adequacy is like a red herring, you know, because when we lose a loved one in other kinds of accidents, whether it's Agent Orange, 911, Deepwater Horizon oil spill, Katrina, we don't ask that question, you know? Like, we know that, like, whatever compensation we get will be inadequate. We still want it. You know what I mean? So I feel like, for me, the question is much more mundane. It's like, if you feel like you're deserving of compensation, what kind of activist project and or legal rationale and or public relations campaign can you mobilize on your behalf to get it? You know, that's how I see it.
Would just add that, of course, that the idea of my presentation and our presentations today were focused on the United States, but I think that perhaps why it's useful to look at other societies that also had genocide of indigenous populations and also then slavery of people of African descent, is that in other places the issue of land has been part of the plans for reparations. Of course, that here in U.S. we had the failed reconstruction that had in the plans, initial plans, just after then by the end of the Civil War to give the 40 acres, that it didn't work. And I know there is a book coming out about this issue in South Carolina, then by a scholar from Columbia. But there are places where land redistribution occurred. We're talking about Brazil. I'm not saying that it's a full project, but remnants of Quilombo communities, then black communities in Brazil, they got the right to own the land. Then this in the Constitution of 1988. We had this in Colombia, in Ecuador as well, for indigenous populations too. And of course, here connecting with what she said at the end of her presentation, that the question of the Cold War, Cuba, even if the agrarian reform was not aimed to redress the issue of slavery, still there was land redistribution, and Afro-Cubans, they benefited from that redistribution, even if, of course, it didn't end racism and it didn't end racial inequalities. Then I think that we see this variety of forms that does not necessarily mean to have a check with a certain amount. And land, yes, for some it means, but perhaps in places where you are talking about where most of the population are living then in urban areas, perhaps this is no longer the center of the demands, but there are places where it is happening, and also places where there is a backlash against this land redistribution. And I would call the attention in particular to the case of Brazil, where these lands were recognized, Afro-Brazilian populations are getting they are living in the communities and they have the right to occupy the land, but they are not being given anymore the titles. And we have all the reasons to believe that with the new government that will start in January 2019, that they no longer get these titles, and perhaps even will lose recognition.
And they want to wipe out the reserves, the indigenous reserves. That's
Oh,
part
yes,
of it.
and this new government, and this is clear that this, but of course, to do so, they need to change the law, but they are already doing in practice, because it's a genocide that is going on, black populations in the urban areas and indigenous populations then in the north area of the country.
Oh, go ahead.
I guess for me, it would be simple. How about addressing all of the disparate rates of our communities? So, home ownership. Our kids are not graduating from high school. Cradle to prison. Slavery to prison. So how about addressing those kinds of numbers and disparate rates as a way of reparation by just making everything equitable and access? So how about increasing entrepreneurship in businesses in our communities? So to me, that would be a multifaceted way of addressing or creating reparations and redress.
I think while you do that, though, there's a real need to educate, because if people don't understand their history. I'm from South Carolina. Our students are required to take a history of South Carolina course. There's a lot of problems with what they're being taught. So, you know, if these things are being done and we're addressing the problems, but we don't have an understanding of how they, you know, how we got to where we are, then is fixing the problem the answer if we don't understand the historical context?
Exactly.
The questions that you all raise about students saying, we give them this, we give them that, we give them that. If you don't understand why, you know, those things are being done, then I don't think the problem is fully solved. And I would like to see a multi-pronged approach. Some folks don't need land. And then who gets, you know, why do we stop at slavery? Jim Crow, you know, affected people. There were so many things that affected people. So how do we decide, you know, who gets reparations? What's the qualification? And then for those of us who can't trace our families back, you know, the records are not there. But we know from oral history maybe that we had people in our family who were enslaved. Or like me, who has one side of my family were slave owners and the other side were enslaved. Do I get reparations for that enslaved, you know, person? But, you know, I also had a slave owning, you know, relative. So I think it's really complicated. It's a conversation that we need to have, but I don't think there's an easy solution.
All right, well, I'm gonna be the wet blanket here. Okay, here's what I'll say about it. I think that we being myself, don't need to be making any of these decisions. It should not be the middle class or the elite making these decisions. It should be people making decisions. Because we might disagree that we don't want your $18, but people might want that, and that's fine. That's okay too. The other thing that I'll say is that I am weary of the disparities discourse, because what the disparities discourse says is that the problem with inequality is that there's a disproportionate number, is the disproportion, which means that as long as the numbers are, that have parity, then the inequality as such is fine. So it's not that there's inequality, but that there's a disproportionate amount of persons who are at the bottom, which means that, and that logic means that the majority of people can still be suffering as long as it's equal across the board, and that is a stupid goal to me. Moreover, I think that I've been talking about expropriation. I think that that's important. Like, I think that if people who have a disproportionate, or not even disproportionate, who have hoarded wealth historically get to keep their shit, then we're socializing poverty. And so they don't get to keep that. You know, like we have to relinquish this understanding of like private property, and that some people get to have what they have because it's really actually not theirs, as I think that many of these papers have been attesting. So, and even with something like education, if we're gonna say like, oh, free tuition, we need to expropriate this curriculum, because the last thing that I want is for future generations to continue to be educated with a Eurocentric, capitalist, you know, individualist curriculum. So I think it's not just about, it's like, what are we redistributing, right? And to what end? So, but I don't know. I don't have any solutions. I'm still trying to understand the problem as well, but I just, you know, I'm a curmudgeon. So when I just hear certain things, I'm just like, nope. Nah.
Can I add something to this, you know, about, I think the question of, like, I think a lot of the papers or questions over the past few days, I think, you know, like, well-intentioned, they suggest that reparations couldn't happen until there's enough public consensus about it or something like that. Like, it relies on the will of the people or the goodwill or the good nature of Americans or something, or whatever your constituents. And I'm wary of that because I think some of the best examples that we can find of governance that was just, people didn't have much choice about it, right? Like, you know, during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. After the Civil War, they seized property from the Confederacy, and people who couldn't accept that were exiled, you know. There are numerous examples we could think of where there was a government plan implemented and it benefited people, but people didn't have a choice about it. And I think both in terms of the legal and even the moral rationale we sometimes use, it is sort of the lack of clarity about the stakes that creates more tension and violence. So for instance, I think most people in the South, many people in the South who descend from slaveholding families feel cheated. You know, like they think somehow that what the Union did was take their property from them and not compensate them, right? And even to allow that idea to sit is to suggest that slavery was somehow justifiable in that that actually they're the victims, you know? But like Southern former slaveholders, that they claim their victim status. And I think what people should be saying to them is that, you know, essentially what you did, you're traitors, first of all. Right. And also that was a crime against humanity. You're lucky you're not in jail, you know? And if that was more often the statement, I think it'd be a lot harder for them to claim victim status. But I think this idea that somehow, you know, so I don't think, to these points, I think the moral and legal rationale used, we should be more clear about. But also I think, you know, ultimately, like good governance could look like a plan for reparations that did not require public consensus, that was just understood as something just, you know.
Feedback off that, I mean, I think we need to sort of also recognize the hard work of not, in a sense, engaging in reparations and reconciliation and redress, right? Incarceration is one of those, right? It's a lot of hard work to incarcerate folks, right? So, but that's why I like also, Michael, your slide that shows sort of massive affirmative action and continual reparation for finance, right? The sort of the endemic, I mean, the third world debt crisis was solved by bailing out Citibank, right? The Asian and Russian financial crisis was solved in the U.S. by bailing out financial traders. You know, 2001.com was actually solved through subprime. Subprime was solved through the $8.5 trillion bailout, which exceeded all the money we spent on every war the U.S. has ever fought, right? So that's sort of massive, entrenched, continual reparation and affirmative action, where one could actually say elite white men. And so I think that sort of corresponding naming of both the hard work of that and the investment in that, and that, you know, in this sort of really sort of perverted way, the sort of struggle to actually not engage in these various reconciliations often feels like to the privilege of, well, so much hard work. Containment is hard work. Dealing is hard work. Incarceration is hard. I've done so much, right? So that embodied hard work through actually maintaining privilege, right? Maintaining privilege is also a way of actually working through anxiety, right? It's sort of privilege and precarity, a cocktail to preserve that privilege. So I think we also need to harness the ways in which that is a kind of inequality and affective inequality that also gets not only rendered visible, but sort of used to promote uneven accumulation based on the ongoing exploitation and appropriation. But so I think that can
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's the conversation is a little bit different in an indigenous conversation, right? Because we're talking about treaty obligations, so it's different language entirely, right? And there's also, the question of, I wasn't here yesterday, but I'm sure that was a reference to the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 and the Supreme Court decision about the Pasapa, the Black Hills. And if you think about the fact that indigenous spirituality is land-based, not event-based, money is never going to be an acceptable alternative, especially for what the land that is considered most sacred to the Oceti-Sakowin, right? So I mean, thinking about it in terms of treaties puts it in entirely different language, right? And a lot of the pushback we get is, oh, but that was, 1848 or 1854 or, whenever it was. And it's like, imagine if Great Britain just said, I know we signed a treaty after the revolution, but we're over it. It was a while ago. So we're just gonna come back and colonize you. And that sounds ridiculous to people, but that's the argument that is made all the time about people wanting to walk away from treaties that the US government made with indigenous nations.
I would just add that those settlements that the Indian Claims Commission made from the 1950s through the 1970s, which incidentally, those are made by usually panels of 3 senior white male jurists, right? Sort of, anyways, those settlements are explicitly aimed at foreclosing treaty obligations, right? Okay, so we paid you, so our hands are clean and this is all done, right? And that comes back to that sort of anxiety about, does reparation sort of foreclose those obligations in the minds of those who are paying, right?
Same thing with Cobell.
Yeah.
That's the whole goal of the Cobell settlement. You take that money, you're out, and you can never make any claim, treaty-based claim, against the federal government again. Right? So
I would co-sign on a ton of everything Karen's saying, Sharice is saying, Michael's saying. This is fantastic. And I think this kind of move, right, towards thinking about reparations in a comprehensive way is vital. So 2 quick kind of just, I think, lessons that we take from the history of reparations, kind of the best practices, as it were. One of the principles of the United Nations kind of come up with, and looking at these different reparative models that have been tried over time for crimes against humanity, that we don't talk enough about, is the guarantee of non-repetition. So this is one of the principles, right, that if there's harm that has happened, right, that any truly reparative, restorative program, right, has to take as its foundation the guarantee that it will not be repeated, right? So if you wave the magic wand and eliminate all of the disparities in the society, right, and tomorrow those disparities reinscribe themselves because structurally you haven't fundamentally altered anything, what have you done, right? What you've done is it's the Malcolm X problem, right? You're pulling the knife halfway out the back, look how much progress we're making, and then the knife gets shoved right back in because you haven't fundamentally changed the society. So this third wave of reparative justice that has been taking shape in United Nations circles that I hinted at my talk yesterday, but that I think needs underlining, is the idea of transformative justice, right? Which kind of tries to combat this problem, and I think is very compatible with socialist revolution, right? And is a method in which, right, you're able to transform fundamentally a society, and that in and of itself will constitute justice, right? Doesn't mean that cash isn't there, right? Doesn't mean that all these other land restoration isn't there, but it means we have to just think very deliberately, right, about what kind of society, what happens after the revolution, right? What happens the day after? What's in place? And if you're not addressing that, and again, you're remaining within a capitalist framework, you're not recognizing that property is theft, right? And we need to return to like indigenous land-based policies and conceptualizations of property that are indigenous rather than Western and rather than capitalist, then whatever, again, the dollar amount is or whatever, there's a prime minister from India, Shashi Tharoor, who has this great saying where he says, any amount that is payable is not sufficient, and any amount that is sufficient is not payable. So you're never going to get there, right? It's one of the definitions of a crime against humanity. It's kind of this irreparable. It's like the bracket in your thing, right? It's impossibility, right, of this happening. But the transformative part is, I think, just critical, right? And I would just, encourage us all to just think that through as we're developing our kind of conceptual frameworks of what reparations can be, should be, might be, and to highlight the democratic part of it. It must be horizontal. I said this yesterday. Must be horizontal. Must be thoroughly democratic. That we get that tradition from Queen Mother Moore and everyone else. That's also UN best practice, by the way, right? They find when it's horizontal, when it involves community members and the ideas of what constitutes repair comes from communities, it works, right? And when it's top down, it's like academics, middle class, bourgeois. It doesn't work. So.
I think they're waving at us that it's time, right, Sarah? Okay, so thank you